Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jennifer Reingold. I'm the global head of content at Egon Zehnder, an executive search and leadership advisory firm, and a former journalist. And I am here with a bunch of amazing women, none of whom I believe is an economist or even an academic. So we're going to get something a little bit different here. I will quickly introduce everyone, and then each woman will speak for about 12 minutes, and then we will have Q&A for 15 minutes. So starting from all the way at the end, I'd like to introduce Gillian Tett. She is the former U.S. managing editor of the Financial Times and has just now been appointed to chairwoman of the editorial board of the Financial Times. And next to her is Joyce DiDonato. She is a multi-Grammy award-winning mezzo-soprano, and I hope some of you have had the opportunity to hear her live. It's amazing. Next to her is Kim Heirston. She is a private art advisor, and she is the founder of Kim Heirston Art Advisory, LLC, and has been in the art market for many years. Next to her, we are lucky to have with us Odile Jacob. She is the founder of Les Éditions Odile Jacob, which is an international publishing house that specializes in science and politics. And finally, next to me is Ianthe Dugan, who is an investigative journalist, award-winning investigative journalist, who most recently spent many years at the Wall Street Journal. So I believe we are going to start with Joyce. And Joyce, you are welcome to sit or stand, whatever works for you. Thank you.
To standing for the diaphragm, the singer thing. Hello, it goes without saying, thank you so much.
You're going to sing, right?
I'm just going to speak. I'm, of course, very honored to be here, and I just want to say that whatever I say in the next 12 minutes is not meant to be blasphemous. To the lovely panels that are here and the topic of discussion today, I start with saying, I wish that money did not make the world go round. And I wish that the earth could orbit on a song that invites you to dance or a poem that compels you to cry instead of the daily spikes of the Dow Jones. I wish we were brave enough to nurture our bouncing, laughing inner child, that one that we long to let out, even if it trained this yearning out of the adult part of ourselves that knows better. I wish the economy, or as I refer to it, the E word, I wish it didn't have such power over the decisions that we feel obliged to make in our everyday life. A business degree over art history, a 401k contribution versus sailing down the Amazon River. I wish the soundtrack of our lives had the beat of our hearts instead of the pulse of our credit cards. But having just surpassed my own personal half-century mark, I'm wise enough to the ways of the world to understand that, as Byron Katie tells us, if you argue with reality, you only lose 100% of the time. I was born in Prairie Village, Kansas, into a large musical and very Catholic family, where making it was never the topic of the conversation at the dinner table. Instead, it was vocation that was on the docket almost daily. So my ambitions were never of fame or fortune or Grammys. Instead, I was looking for where my talents might take me and to be of service. And at the wise, sure age of 18, I was certain that my fate was that to be of a high school choral director. And so you can imagine my shock and awe when the operatic bug very unexpectedly bit me out of nowhere. And with all of my naivete intact, I decided to follow that call. And it's this undertaking that has brought me into refugee camps in Athens and to the Royal Opera House in London, and to sing for prisoners, as well as to join the legends who have performed on the stage of Carnegie Hall. So I really am that naive girl who believes that music can save the world, or at least the world of a single ordinary person. I've received more than a handful of letters from young women who told me that they were ready to take their own lives, when in desperation they turned to music as a last resort. And the comforting, healing vibrations they found there kept them from swallowing the pills in their hand. I really am that crazy dreamer that believes that music can transform lives. In singing opera for the men incarcerated at Sing Sing maximum security prison, one of them approached me on my second visit to say that his life had been changed since my appearance there 10 months earlier. "You see," he said, "I didn't know opera existed before you came here, and now I know that I need to write one of my own." Joseph is now in the process of completing his first opera around the theme of the search for forgiveness. I really am that obstinate optimist who is certain that music can unite the world through its universal language of harmony. I mean, just look at the scenes earlier this week on our televisions from France, in front of Notre Dame, engulfed in flames, and without direction and without any organization, people fell to their knees and they sang. They sang together, uniting their voices in harmony, and it was there that they found comfort and unity and humanity. Like you, I am many things, but seconding that, I am not an economist, and I am not an expert on the E word, but as I accepted this beautiful challenge from Professor Phelps to prepare for today, a few things occurred to me that I hope will offer you some points of reflection as we all search for an effective way to change the world for the better. So as a mezzo-soprano, I'm part of an industry that has always elevated and venerated the prima donna, the first lady of the stage. For nearly 4.5 centuries, half as long as Notre Dame has been standing, the diva has been revered. Occasionally, she has also been reviled, but generally, she has been revered. She's been toasted. Her photo is the large one that goes all around the city with her name in the largest font. And she's been spotlighted. Almost without exception, the woman gets the final bow on the stage. We get the final credit. We're showered with roses and flowers occasionally at the end of the stage. The curtain falls down. But perhaps most intriguing to this discussion today, she has nearly always been the top wage earner. Not even the recipient of equal pay, but more often than not, the leading soprano takes home the highest fee of the night. There were the 3 tenors. That's slightly exceptional. But in general, it's the soprano. Not necessarily the mezzo-soprano, because in Italian mezzo means half. So I'm not quite to the stage of the sopranos, but still it is the woman at the end of the night that takes home the highest fee. I spend my days at my office inhabiting roles from across the centuries that without a hint of apology require me to play strong, capable women, often assuming roles of leadership. I sing queens and martyrs, peacemakers, occasional murderers, power-hungry house of card types. And okay, yes, there have been a few princesses along the way, but usually they are the peacemakers at the end of the opera. And they are sort of going all forward, and in all the male blustering chaos, they're finding a way to broker peace. But I've been given permission from this glorious ancient art form that suffers from an utterly ignorant modern-day misconception that it's old-fashioned and outdated. I've been given this permission to be mighty and to be loud and confrontational and victorious and dramatic, even to have the audacity to open my heart and suffer from the depths of my being right in front of your very eyes and ears. And to do it all without a microphone, in front of thousands of hopefully applauding people, including men. Not only have I been given permission to soar by some of the greatest creative minds in history, Mozart and Handel and Bach and Schubert, but the audience arrives in their seats hungry to be carried away by my voice. Not only am I allowed to help you cry, I'm granted permission to thrill you and to help you transcend your current state of mind. And I get equal pay. Because somewhere along the line, talking about culture, the enlightened, elevated society that valued culture knew the importance of the humanity that is represented and fulfilled in the arts. It knew the power of encouraging its citizens to challenge themselves by boldly looking straight into the mirror within the safety of that theater and to learn and grow and reflect and thrive. There is so much that the operatic world gets right about humanity. It recognizes the inherent power of women and celebrates the vast complexity and theatricality of our inner lives. In fact, this vulnerability showcased and applauded, not silenced under the expectation to not be too vocal or too obstinate or too powerful. The theater is a safe place to dare to be audacious and to invite the audience to viscerally experience these sensations on the stage that we are safely allowed to experience. And yet, my industry is still primarily run by men. The composers, the conductors, the stage directors, the intendants. Like the rest of corporate America, they're primarily male. So where's the disconnect, I ask myself. And then I go back to this wish list that I have. I say, why can't the world mimic the stage where it's so perfect here? Why don't we learn from it? Why is humanity so stuck and stubborn and fearful? My hope lies in the experience of an audience connecting to my voice on the stage when it doesn't dare breathe during the aria, where my character is weeping at the loss of her womanhood, or where they can't contain their ovation at the end of a 3-hour opera when I get to sing a rousing celebration of peace that my character has single-handedly brokered because she's been courageous and resilient. My hope resides in the belief that via the empathy we can experience as we open ourselves up to the plight of a woman brutally outcast from society that we witness on the stage, we just might be guided to make different policy choices. We might look for more justice and equality in our everyday life because we have learned from the mistakes of the Capulets and the Montagues and of the Sharks and the Jets. We might dare to be a bit more vocal, a bit more loud, and a bit more audacious, dare I say operatic, in how we speak for those who are not allowed to carry power in our current society. As we explore the intricacies of the modern woman's role in our economy, I would plead all of us here to use the theater as one of our guides, reminding us that we are not statistics, we are not percentages, we are not polling data and algorithms. We are elaborate, complex, courageous, vulnerable, nurturing, powerful individual forces who should be celebrated and venerated like the great prima donnas of the past and a few of the ones of the present day. There's a reason my art form is still here and thriving after 450 years since its birth. It has so much to teach us if we bother to listen, so much inspiration to impart, so much unamplified power to harness. So while I arrive here today with my utopian wish list about my ideal world, I'm also realistic about the hurdles and the walls in our way. And I'm not arguing with reality, with what is. I just call us all to think and act with more operatic audacity and to trust in this maternal, nurturing, powerful feminine energy that we possess, one that the opera world has always recognized and revered, and to take our place on the world stage and to enact the change that we know we are capable of making if we dare. The shifts in thinking that we know the planet is in desperate need of, and to find the voices within ourselves as we speak out for inclusion and social justice and equality and harmony. I have one very quick, now 14-second thing that I just want to share with you as to inspire you and send you out into the world. And going back to my Catholic upbringing, it's by the Mother Abbess. Climb every mountain, search high and low, follow every byway, every path you know. Climb every mountain, search high and low. Follow every rainbow, every path you know. A dream that will need all the love you can give every day of your life, for as long as you live. Climb every mountain, ford every stream, follow every byway, till you find your dream. Thank you.
That was an unexpected treat. Thank you so much, Joyce. And Kim, before I welcome you to the stage, I would like to say there is no pressure to sing.
That's a good thing, because I was singing in the shower this morning, but I can't even begin
Kim
to
Heirston.
come close to that. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here on Good Friday. I'm going to wish you also happy Passover, happy Easter, and all the rest. Anyway, thank you so much, Ned, for including me in this incredible, incredible conference today. It's absolutely been extraordinary, and I've learned so much. And I want to thank you to Viviana. A lot has been mentioned. A lot of people have mentioned mentorship today, and I think mentorship is interesting because it occurs in many different phases and in many different facets. And sometimes mentors are silent mentors. Sometimes you can go and see someone getting an award like the Légion d'honneur and be inspired by that, or just be inspired by knowing that you know a Nobel laureate. Other times you're inspired just by seeing a couple that you think is an amazing couple, and I think Ned and Viviana are models and mentors to all of us. So again, I really appreciate being included today. The other mentor in my life, and she's sadly no longer with me, was my mom. My mom was a painter, not by profession. This was something that she did as a hobby. And I used to tease her a great deal about that because she did a lot of watercolors, and she did a lot of work on paper, usually landscapes. But my mom also suffered terribly from depression. And when I saw her paint, I saw a smile come over her face. When I saw her looking at Van Gogh's Starry Nights, I saw her smile. And I realized at a very early age that art was a potent antidepressant. And that's a very strong message for a young girl as she's thinking about what she's going to do later in life. I spent a lot of time looking at Janssen's History of Art, a book that when I was sprawled out on our shag carpet watching and going through the pages, there were no women, interestingly enough, and now I think there's 6, so there's a little progress there. I am an art advisor, a post-war and contemporary art advisor, and I'd just like to see a show of hands who knows what an art advisor does, or has ever worked with an art advisor, or knows an art advisor. I know. Okay, that's not bad. Most people don't know what an art advisor is, and I like to say that I am part art historian, part curator, part interior decorator, mixed with that financial advisor, so I have to know about numbers too, unfortunately. I totally agree. I'd love to just think about art history all of the time. Then Cuisinarted into that mix is a little bit of a few other things. High-end concierge, and sometimes couples therapist. Actually, that's where my skills really kick in, because I'll have a husband who wants to know about the financial potential investment of a picture, and I'll have the wife saying, but I love it, or vice versa, actually a lot vice versa. But I am very fortunate. It really resonated what Joyce said about just being in a space where you get to deal with ideas and beauty all of the time. I'm so lucky. My office can be Chelsea, going around and looking at galleries. It can be the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where I go. And speaking of antidepressants, and this is true, if I lose a deal, thank goodness I don't suffer from what my mother suffered and cured herself from. When I've lost a deal or something's gone wrong in my business, I will go to the Met and I'll look at a Puvis de Chavannes, or I will look at a great Monet, and those have the power to lift my spirits, and I think that's what makes art so powerful, and why people pay the prices that they're paying that you read about these days. So I feel very, very fortunate. The other thing I want to say about being in the art world is the fact that, aside from the fact that it's uplifting, it's a place of ideas. You learn about not only art history, you learn about history, you learn about economies, you learn about different places, you learn about different people, you learn about different cultures. So it's every time you look at a painting, you travel the world. And that's something that I think I'm very, very lucky to be in this sphere. So since we are talking about inclusiveness, and I think by virtue of my being here and doing what I do with some measure of success, speaks to the inclusiveness of the art world. It is inclusive, and it's had a history of very strong women. Again, Joyce mentioned Notre Dame, and if we think about it and take a minute, that's an example and a symbol of amazing, extraordinary Gothic architecture, but it's also called Notre Dame. It is referencing a woman. It's referencing, and in apropos Easter, it's referencing, of course, Mary. So much of art history has incorporated women by virtue of images, because a lot of the great paintings have been of women. So maybe it starts there. Something that I like to point out is, especially with respect to America's being a leader when it takes over from France, when it takes over from Paris in the late 40s, early 50s, mostly as a result of war, the World War II, and a lot of French surrealists primarily coming to New York. This is where the art market booms in America. And at the same time, you have a lot of really strong women who are taking central roles. There's a fantastic book out right now. I urge you to read it, although you may curse me. Some women have told me that it's changed their lives, particularly artists. It's called 9th Street Women, and it's by a woman called Mary Gabriel. And it's just, again, it's a huge book, but it talks about the history of the abstract expressionist movement in the late 40s, early 50s, through the lens of 5 powerful women, a number of whom are being shown in a slideshow behind me. It is Lee Krasner, who is the wife of Jackson Pollock. Without Lee, we wouldn't have Jackson Pollock. There's a story, not in the book actually, about how Jackson Pollock goes to see Lee's work because he thinks Lee is a man. And it's a phenomenal story. There's another part in the story that I love, but it's heartbreaking, where she's called up, and the person on the other end is Barnett Newman, another famous abstract expressionist, and he says, put Jackson on the line. And it's kind of bypassing her for the very famous photo that has cemented the abstract expressionist group. All of the men, there's one woman in there, but he doesn't even want to talk to Lee. He just wants to talk to Jackson, and of course Lee never forgives him. So there's Lee Krasner. Then there is Elaine de Kooning, who is the wife of Willem de Kooning. But Lee, in her own right, was an incredible, not only artist, but she wrote for Art News, and she was one of the people who actually chronicled the abstract expressionist movement, again in the late 40s, early 50s. So she's incredibly important for having given voice to a generation of artists. And aside from that, you have a woman called Joan Mitchell, who I was fortunate enough to know when I worked at a gallery called Robert Miller, and we represented 5 powerhouse artists. Joan being one of them. I got to know her. She would give me all sorts of information to read and books, and she'd say, "Here, Yale, take this, and then tell me what you think." And Joan was amazing and powerful, and we had Helen Frankenthaler in the gallery upstairs. So there were all these really powerful women that I was surrounded by. Louise Bourgeois, Eva Hesse, and again, we represented the estate of Lee Krasner. So I had this incredible education. It was really a man who started the gallery, but he had the absolute great sense to incorporate a lot of women in the gallery. And so I learned so much, again, on the subject of mentorship from this man who had the vision to show these women who were going for nothing at the time. I mean, when I say nothing, it's not nothing, but maybe $10,000, $20,000, $30,000. And now these women are fetching tens of millions of dollars, and it's so exciting to see. Again, on my slideshow of my spiritual godmothers, there's Joan Mitchell, who recently sold a work called Blueberries that sold for $20 million. There is Lee Krasner, again, the wife of Jackson Pollock, that's coming up for sale, that's meant to sell for in excess of $10 million. So these are big numbers. But they don't compare to some of the numbers that are being fetched by the men. Of course, everyone knows about the famous Leonardo da Vinci, which recently sold for almost $500 million. But to make a little bit more of a comparison, the highest price paid for a living artist is David Hockney, a work called Portrait, Self-Portrait by the Pool, and that sold for $80 million. And then, of course, there's Jeff Koons, who had a beautiful orange balloon dog outside of Christie's at Rockefeller Center that sold for a whopping nearly $60 million. By contrast, and again, I have a slide up here of a work by Jenny Saville that in 2018 sold for $12 million. So living artist to living artist, that's not a great story, but the point is we're on the move. So a couple of statistics, because this is an economic conference, and I thought I should have a few. 51% of visual artists in the United States are women. That's awesome news. I was actually surprised to see that statistic and glad that I had to look it up. Women typically make 81 to 85 cents on the dollar. That's more good news, I think, and I think better than most industries, at least from what I understand. The last thing is apparently the art world provides an incredible working environment for women in terms of maternity leave and allowing flexibility primarily. So it's a really terrific place to be because women have more time to actually look after families, and it's not something that is frowned upon in our world. So the bad news is, very quickly, is that more good news, women represent and lead a lot of our institutions. Women have founded most galleries. Women have founded the 3 most important museums in New York, the Museum of Modern Art, the Guggenheim Museum, and the Whitney, which was started by Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, and she actually hired the first director. There has not been a woman director to head those 3 museums since. So it's still a bit of a problem, but we do represent, and we are making so many strides with respect to institutions, so this is really a fantastic thing. And circling back, because I do see that I'm out of time, there's so many things I wanted to talk about, like the Guerrilla Girls in the 80s, who actually were real pioneers to help stage interventions so that more artists would be shown, more women artists would be shown in museums. But there's not enough time to go there. But I will say that mentorship is important. It's an incredibly, I found it to be important in my life. And I just want to throw this out there that if anybody has any interest in being in the art world, I'm here to mentor you. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next up is Gillian Tett. Surprise.
Yeah, sorry, I got the order wrong. Okay, I'll collect my thoughts. Well, first point to make is I am not talking about anything nearly as glamorous and exciting as opera or art. So sorry to disappoint you. I'm talking about financial journalism, and I'm not going to sing. Second point is I'm talking to you both as someone who did a PhD in cultural anthropology and as someone who then turned into a financial journalist. When I did my PhD in cultural anthropology, I worked in Central Asia in 3 different locations, but I did most of my fieldwork for my doctorate in Tajikistan, actually looking at women's issues and how they intersected with the clash between the then Soviet system and the world of Islam. So I've always been extremely interested in women's issues and how that intersects with culture. But after doing my PhD and then working as a while for a war reporter and a foreign correspondent, I then joined the Financial Times and got seriously boring and became a financial journalist covering markets and economics. And initially, none of my work on gender studies seemed to have anything whatsoever to do with my newly boring day job because there just were no women. In the FT when I joined it, and I am old and crumbly, so I joined it in 1993, there were no women in the senior management of the FT, and there were pretty few women even in the middle ranks, and very few in financial and economic journalism. And there were almost no women in any of the stories I wrote. There were very few female bankers, few female central bankers or anyone in power, and I almost never got to quote a woman or interview a woman. It was quite stark. Why was that? Well, it's partly because of issues which have been touched on today to do with culture and power. But I think there was something else as well going on there, which is that historically money, particularly in British culture, in English culture, has been seen as very unfeminine and something that wasn't really in the realm of what women did. In journalism, women, when they began to break into journalism, tended to write about almost anything other than money because somehow it was seen as being pretty male. And behind that, there's another set of ideas which I think is really not often discussed, but to do with my anthropology background, which is partly because women were not seen as being particularly linked to the world of money. In fact, in English culture, money was almost seen as being unfeminine and a bit dirty and something that women didn't really want to go out and talk about, grab, be seen to be dominating. Insofar as people think that economics and business is about the world of money, that led to the role that women play being doubly discounted. And by that I mean, and apologies to all of you who are economists in the room, because I love you, I think you're great, I've written about you for much of my life, particularly the Nobel Prize winners amongst us. But I think that economists miss part of the picture, because as an anthropologist, I look at economies in the wider sense in terms of exchanges in every sense. Credit, barter, non-monetary exchanges matter enormously too. And that often has got knocked out of classic economics because they tend to focus more on money. So the stuff that women do to contribute to the economy and society and make stuff work, whether it's childcare, whether it's other forms of non-monetary exchanges, domestic work, all the stuff that makes our life work, which are exchanges in the wider sense, but don't involve money, tend to get knocked out of the picture comprehensively. All kinds of problems with that in terms of how anthropologists look at economics versus economists, but I'm not going to talk about that now. But I just make that point now, quickly. So I was basically dealing with a bit of a female desert for the first few years of my career. And the good news is that over my 25 years of being a financial journalist and working in London, then in the former Soviet Union, which was then the former Soviet Union, then in Tokyo, then in America, and then back in Europe, and now back in America again. A lot of things have changed in ways that would have been almost unimaginable 25 years ago. So if you want reasons to be cheerful, now that the sun has come out and it's almost summer, these days there are plenty of women in senior roles in the media world, many of them. When I started, it would have been impossible for me to have a female mentor because there just wasn't anyone to mentor me. Now, to pick up on your point, there are plenty of women mentoring younger women in media. There are female editors. There are a few female owners. I mean, there actually is a real sense of change. It's not yet totally equal. I wouldn't try to kid anyone of that. There is still a tremendous shortage of women who tend to go into economics and financial reporting. Not shortage, wrong word. There are fewer women in that sphere than there are in other spheres. I happen to benefit from that enormously because almost every single investment banking conference in the world these days is under pressure to have at least one woman on their panel. And there's only about 3 or 4 of what we jokingly call econ chicks who can be female economic commentators and columnists. We happen to actually have most of them at the FT. I mean, seriously. And we're kind of rotated. In much the same way, ironically, that I used to rotate the women I could quote when I was first starting. So I benefit from that. But, there's a shortage of women journalists who say, yes, I really want to write about derivatives or finance, etc. So it's changing, but we're not yet at parity. Secondly, as far as the wider world of finance is concerned that I write on and report on, again, the good news is that there are more women entering. I'm not going to pretend for a minute that it's equal on Wall Street, but it's better than it was. And there are also more women, frankly, to be quoted a lot. And there are a lot more women in the public eye in photographs. And I cannot stress how important that is in terms of demonstration value, because I passionately believe that notwithstanding how many times people like me are asked to go to conferences and give speeches to young female students or girls or anything else like that, and tell them, yes, you can become a female economics commentator, a picture speaks 1,000 words. When I first started my career, it would have been unimaginable to have a picture of the Fed chairman basically as a woman, let alone to have a picture, and I was so proud when we had this on the front page, of the Fed chairman, the German leader, and the head of the IMF all together in a picture talking about economics and not talking about gender issues, just talking about economic issues. Those visuals are unbelievably powerful. And it's actually not that hard to find women to quote in the pages. I'm not going to pretend that it's perfect. There's still a tremendous unconscious bias. There's still a tendency to end up quoting men and putting men in the pictures, just because, guess what? Culture shapes how we think. And in fact, at the FT, we were so aware of that recently that we actually launched something called a Janet bot. And a Janet bot is an automatic tool that's using some AI, which tracks how many female pictures we've got on the pages and on the websites. And if we end up with an all-male page, then we start to try and self-correct. Again, it's a question, should you be using quotas or not? The good news is, actually, we don't always need quotas these days, because actually we don't have to manufacture interesting women to quote and to actually have pictures of. Doesn't always play out quite as we hoped or expected. Sometimes women in the public eye in economics can actually be there for slightly the wrong reasons. Partly because women were slightly exotic in the world of Wall Street and high finance in the past. There has been a tendency to focus a bit too much on them sometimes. And I say that with some feeling and some guilt, because a few years ago, I wrote a book about the way that originally the JP Morgan bankers in the late 1990s, early noughties, had created the idea of credit derivatives and then seen their creations spiral out of control and contribute as one part to the financial crisis. And when I wrote about that book, I wrote originally a magazine cover and then a book about this, there were actually 5 or 6 different characters who were at the center of this story. And 5 of them were men, 1 was a woman, and as it happened, an extremely telegenic woman. And when it came to the magazine piece, guess whose picture was all over the front? And when it came to the book, Guess who, out of those 6 characters, had obsessive interest in the media and got very badly trolled? The men didn't get trolled, the male bankers. It was a female banker who got trolled, and in fact then got described as a woman who created the weapons of mass destruction, even though the men had done it too. So sometimes being a woman in the public eye is tough. And we as journalists have to constantly think about how we are reporting on the world, not because we necessarily have to be activists in terms of quotas, but because we have to try to actually make sure that we do not become captured by these unconscious biases that assume that somehow money is all about men. Last point is, though, that when it comes back to the issue I raised from an anthropological perspective, which is how we define the economy, I actually don't think there's been very much change. And I do think that plays into the gender issues a bit, because, you know, yes, we're telling women these days that they can have control of their money, and that's good. And yes, we know that money makes the world go round, and that money equals power, etc., etc. But money is not the only part of the economy that actually makes the economy tick. For what it's worth, I think that Silicon Valley these days is in a fascinating state, because Silicon Valley is actually driven these days by barter transactions rather than monetary transactions. I give up my data in exchange for services. And economists, with all due respect, don't have the skills to look at that barter, nor do lawyers, nor do politicians, nor do most of us. It's why most of us misunderstand Silicon Valley. And so it's possible that as we're forced to think about non-monetary transactions going forward, we will start to maybe rethink some of our visions of economics, and that could have some very interesting ideas about how we think about women, power, etc., etc. Maybe that will make us recognize the role that women have always played in contributing to the economy. But I know that's outside the scope of what we're talking about today. I'll just say that as someone who is with the Financial Times, there's lots of reasons to feel depressed and discouraged when you think about women in finance. But there's also reasons to actually feel incredibly encouraged when I look back over the last 25 years. And if nothing else, because when we had a discussion recently at the FT, we thought, okay, if we want to do something about women in finance, women in economics, how should we do it? And I said, well, maybe what we should do is talk about pink power. And no one laughed, and that's good.
Thank you very much, Gillian. Next up, we are going to hear from Ianthe Dugan, most recently of the Wall Street Journal, a little bit about her life in journalism.
So about 30 years ago, I was interning for a local newspaper on Long Island. Interning meaning working for free. So on the side, I answered phones at an ad agency, wrote press releases, and the agency was run by, well, he was a groper. He groped, and the art director was no better. But I needed the paycheck, so I sort of persevered. And one day I was answering phones and flipping through the local business newspaper, and I noticed they had a new editor, and a light bulb went off. And I picked up the phone and I called him, and I said, hey, you know, I have some clips, and I know all about the ad business, so maybe if you need an advertising writer, I can come and work for you. So he said, okay, let's have an interview. And I said, sure, but rather than drive out to Ronkonkoma, exit 60 of the Long Island Expressway, he saved me the trip and said, I'll tell you what, I'll come and meet you at a bar near your house, like this Friday night. And I said, okay. So I can drive over in my 68 green Mustang and bring my clips, and we have a few drinks, and he says, you know, the clips are great. He doesn't even read them, and walks me out to my car, and he then tries to kiss me as if we're ending a date. And so I speed away, and the next day I call my mother, you know, and I never asked her for advice. My mother was a feminist. She actually worked at Ms. Magazine with Gloria Steinem the first year it was founded, and she would bring me in there, and she introduced me to Billie Jean King one day. So, you know, I was one of 5 girls, and I was really raised, you know, in this environment that, you know, women and media and, you know, we were all going to be equal. And so, anyway, my mother said, you know, you got to run the other way. You can't work for this groper. So I got a call on Monday from this editor, and I told him I can't come work for you. And he said, well, was it because I touched you? And I said, yes. And he said, well, you know, I used to play touch football in college. So I'm used to touching people. And, you know, you really should come and meet this nice old couple that owns this paper. And so anyway, I did go out there. I took the job and made sure that, you know, I wasn't in the office with him on off hours. I would pack up my Cape Row. Does anybody remember the Cape Row computer? It was like 26 pounds. And, you know, I would like lug it home to get away from him and bring work home. Anyway, after a couple of weeks, he was gone. He was replaced by a female editor who became a mentor for me. And my business journalism career was launched. And I have to say, I actually didn't find it boring. I thought business journalism was really exciting. So anyway, now you might think with a story like that my talk is going to be about sexual harassment or Me Too or something along those lines. And it's partly about that, but just partly, because while that's where the industry was when I started, I don't see journalism there today. To be clear, sexism still exists. Sexual harassment is rampant, and the commanding heights of journalism are still dominated by men. But that's actually not the biggest concern I have for young women entering journalism today. See, when I got started, the hardest part about being a woman in journalism was being a woman. But I don't think that's still the case. Today, when I look around the industry and older colleagues and younger reporters, instead what I find is that the hardest part about being a woman in journalism is being a journalist. For the next few minutes, I'd like to share what I've seen during the transition, since I think what's happened to the press over the past 30 years tells us something important about our moment and the work we've got ahead of us. But it's important for me to say up front that this isn't a sob story. My career has been some admixture of being fortunate and working hard, and that admixture has brought me some amount of success. You know, being an investigative reporter at the Wall Street Journal, a Pulitzer finalist and a Loeb Award winner felt pretty great. Getting tapped to research a major movie starring Tom Cruise was loads of fun, but I also know it's been much harder for some colleagues, often for reasons outside their control. One of the issues, of course, is the economics. And newspapers were once, you know, flush with advertising and subscription revenues, and competition for talent was fierce. When I was only 22, I left the business newspaper to start a real estate section and a business section for another local chain of papers. I called my dad, who'd been working at a periodical called Current Biography for 30 years. And he said, wow, how much are you getting paid? And I said, $35,000. And there was a pause, and I said, what's wrong? And he said, that's what I earn. So I worked my way, you know, into daily newspapers, eventually getting hired at Newsday. And they did have a job sharing plan for women. When I had my daughter 25 years ago, they subsidized a daycare center. I could go visit her at lunch. They gave me a crib. It was like the industry was really flush. And then I moved on to New York Newsday. And you remember New York Newsday? So the first day I arrived in the office to cover Wall Street feeling like I've made it. I walk in and they're shutting the paper down my very first day. So, and I remember once word got out that all these reporters were getting laid off, The newsroom became this job fair. There were magazine and newspaper editors from all around coming in and setting up shop and trying to scoop up some reporters. The Washington Post sent in an editor, and he was holding court, and when it was my turn, after, the usual questions, he asked me if I had children. He asked how old I was. He asked if I was married. I said I had a young daughter, and I was in the midst of a divorce. He said, yeah, we once hired a woman with a young child who was in the midst of a divorce, and we decided we'd never do that again. It didn't work. And he told me her name, and she happens to be a thriving reporter at the New York Times now, but anyway. So you can imagine how I felt a few years later when I was hired to be the Wall Street reporter at the Washington Post in New York. So times have changed. I don't think an editor would ask a job applicant these questions now. Women in management roles at newspapers have come a long way, including some right in this room and on this panel. The Journal in recent years took major steps to promote women after acknowledging pay disparities and after losing its top female editor. When I look around today and see all the conversations and have gotten started about sexism and harassment and masculinity over the past few years, it seems very hopeful. But I worry that these strides could lose momentum if the industry erodes. The print industry is a dried out husk of what it once was. We all thought it was bad back in 2008 when the economy tanked. I saw a Pew Research report this week that said that newsroom employment had dropped another quarter since then. Young reporters are being hired, but at dwindling salaries. There are some reporters starting out today at the same $35,000 I earned all those years ago. In 2019 dollars, for you economists out there. So that's what I mean when I say that the hardest part about being a woman in journalism today is just being a journalist. And weirdly, it's never been easier to be a writer. But being a writer in a newsroom with the support of an entire institution behind you, I mean, at the Wall Street Journal, there's reams of editors and data specialists and lawyers, and reporters often have the luxury of time. That's becoming rarer. But I'm not here to be depressing because I have a lot of hope. But we absolutely must see that the old model is dying and be aware of what might get lost if we don't make an effort to replace it with something new and better and more adaptable to our world. And there are people out there doing this right now, and they're producing some remarkable work. Just this week, ProPublica, a nonprofit newsroom formed just over a decade ago, won its latest Pulitzer, and the reporter happens to be a woman. And the founder, Paul Steiger, is sitting right here. And he was one of my original mentors at the Journal 19 years ago. So just looking over the judging panels for the Pulitzers, I see editors and media outlets that didn't exist until recently. The Trace, 538, BuzzFeed, Politico, PolitiFact, The Intercept. Just this morning, I was talking to a former newspaper editor who's starting a new company telling true stories through comic books. He had worked at Marvel until a few years ago, and he said at Marvel he made all these efforts to start representing women in comic books. He said women want to read comics that represent them. Women are tired of being objectified. He said this without knowing I was coming here to speak today. And he said when he left, there were 17 titles that were about women, and that they made this real concerted effort to do this. So new platforms are boosting women's voices. Susan Fowler felt a few years back that as an engineer at Uber, she wasn't being heard by supervisors and HR, so she went online to an outlet called Medium to write about the problem herself. And it shook Silicon Valley. That's good and bad news for journalism. It shows, how many unconventional outlets there are for reporting stories, but it also shows how easy it can be to sometimes skip professional reporters altogether. We have a president who tweets when he has a message. Hell, even the Washington Post's owner went directly to Medium to tell the story about, let's get back to women. Okay, a reporter I used to work with named Julia Angwin recently left ProPublica to launch the markup. She got backing from, among others, Craig Newmark, the founder of Craigslist, which has been blamed by some for destroying classified ad revenue. And Newmark said he wanted to contribute because, quote, a trustworthy press is the immune system of democracy. And I think he's right. And when we talk about freedom of the press, we aren't just talking about reporting on government. Business reporting at its best, shines a light on powerful corporations and institutions. But when I look back on the first half of my career, and yes, I said first half because I'm just getting started, I see a remarkable amount of change in a remarkably short period of time. Much of that change has been for the best. We've continued to lower the barriers to entry for women, and I expect we'll continue to do so. But we also have to stay vigilant. Vigilant because the capitalism side of the industry is in upheaval. We have yet to find a sustainable model that supports all the journalism our country needs, and we need to be vigilant about the political status of journalism. Around the world, it's more acceptable than ever for strongmen and wannabe strongmen to call journalists, reporters, people who make it their job to report facts, enemies of the people. Can these obstacles be overcome? Absolutely. But doing that, I think, will require that we hold both views in our sight at the same time. It means avoiding blissful apathy, but also avoiding despair. It means, I think, celebrating all the progress we've made, the very real progress I've seen in my own lifetime, and remaining watchful as we press on in a world of states and men increasingly threatened by the truth. Thank you. And thank you, Ned, for having me.
Thank you so much, Ianthe. And last but most definitely not least, do you want to sit? I'd like to reintroduce Odile Jacob.
What is this? Good afternoon. I would like first to thank Professor Phelps and Viviana for this invitation. I am very honored and very proud to be with you today and to address such a distinguished group. Because the principal theme of today's very broad topic concerns the experiences of women in the economy, I will talk about my own experience, my personal experience. I hope that it will help other women and the new generations of women. To begin with, let me introduce myself. My name is Odile Jacob. I am the founder and the CEO of Éditions Odile Jacob, a French publishing house. We are entirely independent. At the time I was planning my new venture, there were already many publishing houses in France. Why would someone create a new one? What was the goal? What did I hope to achieve? In the very crowded publishing landscape in France, my aim was to create something new. First, it had to be unique, not like other publishing houses. Second, I wanted it to be very modern, open to the broadest ideas, the ideas of the future. A truly international publishing house which would publish leading French, European, and American thinkers, showcasing the vibrancy and strength of the cultural and scientific ties between both sides of the Atlantic. Next, I wanted readers to discover new areas of knowledge, fields that had not been explored yet in French publishers, neurosciences, for example, as well as new authors, poised to reshape the French intellectual landscape. I hoped to reach the largest audience possible, with works by authors in every field of knowledge to make readers aware of the tremendous advances of science today and to allow them to anticipate the great challenges of the world of tomorrow. I wanted to show that science is an integral part of culture. Finally, I wanted my publishing house to combine science and politics and to unite in a single catalogue the greatest scientists, Nobel Prize and Fields Medal winners with outstanding heads of states such as George Bush the father and Bill Clinton, whose accomplishments are no less vital than those of intellectuals. It was a bet, an enormous challenge, and no one believed I could pull it off. I did it. Today, after many years and more than 4,000 published books, what comes first to mind is the sheer quantity of work accomplished. Then, there were the obstacles I had to overcome, most of them because I think I was a woman. Or at least one of the oldest stereotypes of a woman, the one who resides in instinct and intuition, but is supposedly not equipped to deal with concept abstractions. Those things are the exclusive domain of men. In this stereotype, women are imbued with sensibility and sensuality, gifted perhaps for the arts and literature, but they are born unfit for abstract thinking or complex ideas. It was incredible that I, a woman, wanted to create a publishing house devoted to sciences, hard sciences, economics, current affairs, and international strategy. A remark I shall never forget was this: you have the brain of a man in the body of a woman. The woman men always look at before they listen to. They suspect that her success is due to a talent for seduction rather than a power of conviction, as if increasingly men didn't use their own power of seduction for those who have it, even over other men. When she begins to be successful, that woman is advised to continue doing what she does so well and not to explore or investigate other areas. In short, to stay in a place. A woman can be a companion, an inspiration, a colleague, but never the boss. In France, it always has been difficult for anyone to create and develop a company, even for a man. But for a woman, it was considered quite simply impossible to start a publishing company from scratch in a publishing industry dominated by third and fourth generation male heirs who own and manage their businesses was totally unrealistic. People might just be able to swallow the idea of a woman creating a business, but not an industrial company. I am a little surprised that this conference has grouped publishing with the arts. Publishing surely is an art, but it is also very much an industry. I would like to stress that point, and here's why. What do you think of when you think of publishing? A social, pleasant, intellectual activity, meeting with fascinating people, discussing their work with them, recommending ways to develop their book, organizing marketing events, convincing journalists of the relevance of the book. But that is only the tip of the huge publishing iceberg. For a publishing house does also function as a bank, both an investment bank and a commercial bank. First, you come up with a project, then mergers and acquisitions, where you have to match subjects with authors. You must convince the author, who is often a renowned scientist, more concerned with peer recognition and with advancing his or her work than with writing for a wide audience. A publisher often pays authors large advances, and these might be financed long-term. Taking into account outstanding advances for all your authors, you truly are operating as a banker. But publishing is also an industry. Although a book is a work of the mind, it is embodied in a material object. What is sold must first be produced. Physical books printed on paper, which in France comprise 95% of volumes sold, and sales revenue must be manufactured first. You must order materials and pay invoices. Book production involves an entire chain of industries. This chain begins with paper factories, a huge industry dependent on oil prices, and continues to typesetting and layout, printing, and bookbinding. It involves vast distribution warehouses. Just a couple of figures. Each year, we print 2.5 million books, and that implies roughly 1,000 tons of paper, which is a lot. Finally, publishing is a retail business because you have to sell the books you produce. From the moment you decide to publish a book and pay an author in advance, to the time you decide to print the first round of that book, you're never sure whether it will sell or even if you recoup your cost. I won't bore you with the problem of returns, of unsold stock, except to say that publishing, like all production businesses, is fundamentally very risky, not to mention the moral and political responsibility of publishing. It was unimaginable that a woman would be able to handle all these things, because you are not only responsible of yourself for the way you manage your own career, for how you develop your talent, but also for your authors, your team, for an entire group of people. For women to assume their rightful place in the economy, it is essential that there be equal pay for equal work. But it is also essential that more and more women reach the highest executive positions in large corporations in both the old and the new economies. And it is crucial that more women create businesses as true entrepreneurs. Not that of all the large corporations everybody talks about, such as the GAFAM, every single one was created by men. It is high time for a new generation of women to found new companies, truly industrial companies. They will then be the sisters and disciples of Coco Chanel, Helena Rubinstein, and Estée Lauder. Women who created empires, but the new generation will create in areas other than those that have traditionally been considered uniquely feminine, like fashion, beauty, perfumes. They will do so in all areas, including those we haven't imagined yet. But for women to get there, each project must be strong and original. The desire to succeed must be a raging fire, and without perseverance, the project will fail. What is the key? Work, work, and more work. But here's the paradox: mentalities, dominant social models, how women are seen, and the most profound archetypes, all these may become increasingly difficult to change as women begin to acquire more power and are emboldened to create their own companies. Why do I say this? Because one profound reason for misogyny, beyond inbred ways of thinking, is the fear men have in seeing themselves overtaken by women. There is already such fierce competition among men for positions, resources, and markets that the idea of women increasing the competition, well, for many men, it can be unbearable. I experienced the violence of such competition when I endeavored to acquire other businesses that were much larger than my own. I was then entering a fight, not just for authors, but also for market share and money. In that world, anything goes. Some people will do whatever it takes to stop you. So I began to dream. I dream of a world in which women and men are reconciled by values of authenticity and harmony and can finally embrace their differences and similarities in the light of equal rights and opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Odile. We have time probably just for a short question, and I'm going to ask it. And I'm going to ask it of each of you so that we can actually leave on a slightly practical note, since there are a lot of economists in the room. The question I have for each of you is, thinking back on your own careers, and you are all powerful women who have achieved things that few women did before you, frankly. And I would just love to hear, in each of your industries, what is one or two things that you think could happen now to effect change toward better gender, if not parity, better progress than we're seeing? And why don't we just go down the end? As Gillian, start with you.
I think probably taking the world of finance and financial innovation and tech innovation out of the existing mainstream companies and ensuring that disruption happens in a way that women can take part in that to the maximum degree possible. And by that I mean that if you look at where women tend to make most progress in the financial world, it tends to be in newer industries, newer sectors where they can be innovators alongside men. So I think that's probably one part of it. Secondly, I'd say simply getting more women into positions of power in the financial and business community, writing about them, picturing them, making sure people know about them, that has a powerful demonstration effect.
Great, thank you.
This may be a mutual theme here, for sure. I would love to see women step into the hiring practices and the scheduling and the composition and the directing of these things, which are still quite heavily dominated by males. But also, I think, again, going into my industry, which is carrying this thing of, well, you're outdated and you're old-fashioned, I think we actually have to step up and call attention to, we've been an industry leader in a long time, and actually own that and be even a little bit more passionate about showing what we have to teach in the theater, and not hanging our heads low and say, yeah, we have to be more relevant. We are. And so I think we have to own that and hire more women behind the scenes.
Thanks, Joyce. Kim?
For certain, have more women leading the major museums and institutions. There are a lot of women who are running museums now, and that's really terrific. But there are virtually none with the big budget institutions, and that's characterized as having a budget of over $15 million per year. So, the Met, the Louvre, the British Museum, I want to see women there. Secondly, and something that's very near and dear to my heart, I'd like to see more women and more art covered in the media. There are lots of books on major male artists. There are a couple of great films on male artists like Basquiat or Pollock, and recently from Julian Schnabel on Vincent van Gogh. Actually, Julian did both the Basquiat and the Vincent film. And it's wonderful, but I think that there should be more arts coverage in the media. It's something that you have in Europe. France is very good with this. The BBC, Britain, all of Europe, and I think America would prefer to watch The Housewives. And that's nothing against The Housewives. One of my dearest friends is a housewife. But the point is, we're into reality television, and we don't really cover the art world, and particularly women.
Well, a few years ago, about 200 people signed a letter to the editor of the Wall Street Journal at the time, and complained about women and people of color not having the same pay and promotions. And so they examined it, and they did agree that that there was some disparity. And it was interesting because it depended on what age group you were in, whether this held true. So something like, I can't remember exactly, but say 30-year-old, 30-somethings, the men were making more than the women. 47-year-old women were making more than men. But overall, there was this disparity, and the journal started this fast-track program, started promoting a bunch of women, setting up mentorships, and I think that the program is working really well. And it is true that most of the major newspapers and magazines now are still run by men, but some of those men are wonderful mentors, and they're really bringing women up the ranks. So I think there's a long way to go, but there are these programs that are sort of in motion right now that, if they continue, I think, there'll be a lot of progress in coming years.
Great, thanks, Ianthe. And Odile? Not now. Okay. I think on that note, we are going to end. I would love to thank our entire group of panelists for a wonderful discussion.